Welcome to The Explainer. In this one, we're going to piece together a very different story of 9/11. We've pulled from several sources to build out an alternative narrative, not just of the attacks themselves, but of the wars that came after. Now, according to the sources we're digging into today, the story of 9/11 doesn't actually start with a plane in the sky. No, it starts with a huge boom in a basement. And this comes from an eyewitness who was, right there when it happened. All right, so let's just dive right in. And we're going to start with the incredible story of a man named William Rodriguez. He was a janitor who, for his actions on that day, became a true national hero. So you got to understand, Rodriguez had been a janitor in the North Tower for 20 years. I mean, he knew that building like the back of his hand. And on September 11th, that knowledge, it literally became a lifeline. He had one of only 5 master keys, and he was using it to get firefighters through locked doors, even rescuing 15 people from the basement himself. He stayed in there with the first responders right up until the very end, until the tower actually collapsed on top of him. With this is where his account throws a huge wrench in the official timeline. He testified that he was down in the sub-basement with a few other people when a massive explosion went off below them. An explosion so powerful, he said it physically pushed them upwards. And here's the kicker. He insists this happened seconds before they ever heard the impact of the first plane, which hit way, way up, almost 100 stories above their heads. So think about this. You have a national hero, right? The last person pulled alive from the rebel, an absolutely crucial eyewitness. He gives all this testimony to the 9/11 Commission, and yet, when the final report comes out, he claims the most important, the most jarring part of his story, that basement explosion that happened before the plane hit, it's just gone, not there. And that's not a new claim. He's been saying this for years. Okay, so from that personal testimony, the narrative in these sources pivots. It moves from what one man experienced to the cold, hard physical evidence of how the towers actually came down. So, the big question these sources ask is what really brought the towers down? Was it the fire, like the official account says, or was it something else entirely? They really dig in and challenge that official cause, proposing a totally different explanation based on what you can see with your own eyes. And this is where it gets really visual. The sources ask you to just look at the footage. Are you watching a building falling down, or is it blowing up? They argue that a simple, gravity-driven collapse doesn't explain how solid concrete got pulverized into dust in mid-air and then shot outwards at incredible speeds. They're saying this looks a lot more like demolition. So really, it boils down to 2 completely different scenarios. The official account says the fires from the jet fuel got so hot they weakened the steel, leading to a collapse. But the sources we're looking at claim that what we saw was something else, a sudden, perfectly symmetrical collapse at near freefall speed. That, they argue, could only happen if all the building support columns were taken out at the exact same time, just like in a controlled demolition. Okay, so after questioning the what and how of the collapse itself, these sources make a huge pivot to the why. They look at what happened after 9/11, focusing on a really shocking claim from a very high-ranking military official, a claim that suggests the wars that followed, they might have already been on the books. And that's the man himself, General Wesley Clark. Now, this isn't just some random officer. He was the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, a top guy. And he's describing a secret memo that he says someone at the Pentagon showed him just a few weeks after the attacks. And what Clark claims is, frankly, mind-blowing. He alleges that right after 9/11, the decision to go to war with Iraq was already a done deal. But that was just the beginning. The plan he says he was told about was way bigger, a 5-year timeline to take out 7 different countries. And the craziest part, there was no evidence at the time connecting any of those nations to the 9/11 attacks. So that begs a huge question, right? If what General Clark says is true, if that memo was real, then why? What was the real motive? This is the final piece of the puzzle, according to these sources. They try to answer that why by connecting this Pentagon memo to a much older, long-term strategy for the region. To find a possible motive, the sources take us way back, all the way to 1982. They point to a document written by an Israeli strategist. It's called the Yinon Plan. And the core idea of this plan was a strategy for Israel to achieve regional superiority. And how would they do that? Well, the plan suggested breaking up the big, powerful Arab states around them into a bunch of smaller, weaker states, often by exploiting existing ethnic and religious tensions. The idea being, these smaller states would be too busy fighting each other to be a threat. And this is where they connect all the dots. The sources basically lay out a timeline that they argue is a grand strategy. It starts in 1982 with the Yinon Plan. Then it jumps to 2001, right after 9/11, with General Clark being shown that memo to take out 7 countries. And then, boom, 2003, the U.S. invades Iraq, the very first country on that list. They're presenting this as the first move in a decades-long game to completely reshape the Middle East. So, what was the ultimate goal of all this, according to these sources? It was something they call the Greater Israel Project, a long-term ambition for Israel to control land stretching from the Nile all the way to the Euphrates. To do that, they argue, you'd first have to neutralize any powerful neighbors, like Iraq, like Syria, that could possibly stand in the way. So there you have it. That's the alternative narrative pieced together from these sources. It's a story that starts with an eyewitness testimony about a mysterious explosion in a basement, connects to physical questions about how the towers actually fell, and ends with a claim about a secret memo and a decades-old plan to remake the Middle East. And so the huge question these sources leave us with is this: what was the real motive behind the war on terror?